The Nexus Combat Academy floated in the void between three star systems, a monument to galactic military prowess that somehow managed to look both intimidating and pretentious at the same time. Its crystalline spires twisted upward like the galaxy's most expensive parking meter, while holographic displays boasted acceptance rates that would make an Ivy League admissions officer weep with envy. The facility had trained the elite warriors of 47 species over the past 3 millennia, and they never let anyone forget it. Currently, the Academy's marble halls echoed with the chittering complaints of Instructor Prime Zekthura, whose crystalline carapace caught the artificial sunlight streaming through the observation deck windows. The Vorthak species had evolved from what could only be described as beetles with delusions of grandeur, and Zekthura embodied everything annoying about that evolutionary path. Her multifaceted eyes gleamed with the particular brand of superiority that comes from never having been punched in any of her 4 faces. The Human Integration Program, she announced to her fellow instructors, mandibles clicking with distaste, is a political farce of the highest order. These mammals barely discovered faster-than-light travel yesterday, and now the Council expects us to train them alongside species that have been perfecting warfare for millennia. The other instructors nodded in what they assumed was sage agreement. There was Thaimon of the Kelthiri, whose tentacled form rippled with condescension, and Battlemaster Crix, whose obsidian exoskeleton had been polished to mirror brightness for today's complaining session. They had all reviewed the human files, of course. Bipedal carbon-based life forms with an alarming tendency toward emotional decision-making and an inexplicable fondness for fermented beverages. Hardly Academy material. Have you seen their preliminary scores? Thaimon gurgled through his breathing apparatus. The human designated as Jade Chen scored adequately on written examinations, but her physical metrics are laughable. Reaction time of 0.15 seconds, cardiovascular efficiency rating of merely exceptional by their species standards, and she apparently comes from a profession they call emergency medicine. How quaint. What the instructors didn't mention, because it would have interfered with their superiority complex, was that Jade Chen's file contained several addendums that none of them had bothered to read. The first noted her specialization in trauma surgery under combat conditions. The second mentioned her previous career as what humans termed a paramedic in something called the Detroit metropolitan area. The third, filed by a rather nervous diplomatic attaché, simply stated, recommend standard protocols. Human demonstrates unusual composure under pressure. The Academy's morning briefing that day had the usual pomp and circumstance, complete with holographic displays showing the academic schedule and weather reports for 17 different atmospheric compositions. Jade Chen sat in the back row of the orientation amphitheater, surrounded by beings that looked like they had been designed by committee and approved by a cosmic department of redundancy department. To her left sat a Zephyrian whose translucent skin pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that apparently indicated emotional states. Currently, those patterns suggested anxiety mixed with what the translation software helpfully labeled as breakfast-related gastric distress. To her right, a Kothak warrior whose idea of casual conversation involved detailed descriptions of honor-based disemboweling techniques native to his home system. Jade nodded politely at her fellow cadets and wondered if the Academy's cafeteria served coffee, or if she'd have to resign herself to whatever passed for stimulants among species that considered photosynthesis a legitimate meal plan. Instructor Prime Zekthura took the podium with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through sheer condescension. Cadets, her voice echoed through the amphitheater's sound system, you represent the finest military minds of your respective species. Some of you more than others. Her multifaceted eyes swept the assembly and lingered meaningfully on the human section, which consisted entirely of Jade Chen and an empty seat that had been reserved for diplomatic purposes. Today begins your weapons familiarization training. We will start with energy-based projectile systems, move through plasma containment devices, and conclude with what we generously term primitive kinetic weapons for those species still working through their technological development phase. The weapons training facility looked like someone had crossed a shooting range with a spaceship showroom, and then added mood lighting for dramatic effect. Holographic targets materialized at various distances, some stationary, others moving in patterns that would challenge a caffeinated hummingbird. The arsenal displayed along the walls would have impressed a small nation, assuming that nation had the good sense to be impressed by energy weapons that could vaporize city blocks. Instructor Zekthara lifted a plasma rifle that hummed with barely contained destructive potential. The weapon was sleek, silver, and roughly the size of a small tree trunk. The Mach 7 plasma disruptor, she announced, fires concentrated energy bursts at approximately 1/10 the speed of light. Effective range: 7 kilometers in standard atmosphere, theoretically unlimited in vacuum. This represents the pinnacle of modern projectile technology. She turned to survey her students, most of whom were taking dutiful notes on tablets that probably cost more than Jade's medical school education. Now, I'll demonstrate proper firing stance and target acquisition. Pay attention, particularly those from species still using chemical propellants and metal projectiles. The dig was about as subtle as a supernova, but Jade merely smiled and continued her observation of the Academy's safety protocols, which appeared to consist mainly of pointing dangerous weapons away from anything expensive. Zekthara raised the plasma rifle, adopted what she clearly considered an intimidating stance, and fired a shot that streaked past Jade's left ear with enough energy to have reduced a small building to constituent atoms. The bolt struck a practice target and turned it into a brief, brilliant explosion of light and regret. "As you can see," the instructor said, lowering the weapon with theatrical precision, accuracy, and power go hand in hand. "This is what separates advanced civilizations from those still learning to harness energy beyond combusting organic compounds." The silence that followed was the kind that usually precedes either applause or revolution. Instead, Jade Chen stood up from her position, walked calmly to Instructor Zekthara, and extended her hand. "May I?" The Vorthak instructor's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement if it hadn't sounded so much like breaking glass. "I hardly think that's advisable, Cadet. This weapon system requires extensive neural interface training and coordination that your species simply hasn't evolved to handle." "I'll be careful," Jade said, with the tone of someone asking to borrow a cup of sugar rather than requesting access to a device capable of orbital bombardment. Zekthara's four eyes glittered with malicious anticipation. An opportunity to demonstrate human inadequacy in front of the entire class was too good to pass up. "Very well. But I warn you, the recoil compensation alone will likely knock you unconscious." She handed over the plasma rifle with the confidence of someone who had never met a human who had spent 6 years pulling people from car wrecks while being shot at by individuals with questionable life choices and extensive criminal records. Jade accepted the weapon, noted its weight distribution, identified the obvious trigger mechanism, and spent approximately 3 seconds analyzing its basic operational principles. Then she raised it, acquired the same target her instructor had hit, and fired. The target exploded in a satisfactory manner. Then she pivoted 4 to 5 degrees and eliminated 6 additional targets in a sequence so rapid that the plasma bolts seemed to form a continuous stream of destruction. The smell of ionized matter filled the training facility along with the sound of expensive equipment being reduced to component particles. She lowered the rifle, engaged what appeared to be the safety mechanism, and handed it back to Instructor Zekthara. "Any questions?" The silence that followed was the kind that usually accompanies natural disasters, or the realization that one's entire worldview has just been demolished by someone who probably learned to shoot using targets that didn't require 3-dimensional mathematics to hit. Battlemaster Crix was the first to find his voice, which emerged as a sound somewhere between grinding metal and existential crisis. How did you compensate for the plasma drift coefficient?" "Same way you'd compensate for wind shear on a bullet," Jade replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "Physics is physics." Instructor Zekthara's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, which in Vorthak body language indicated either deep thought or complete system failure. The neural interface requirements alone should have prevented target acquisition. Your species lacks the necessary cranial modifications for direct weapon integration. Jade tilted her head slightly, the gesture suggesting polite curiosity rather than condescension. "You mean the targeting system?" "I turned it off. It was adding unnecessary lag time to target acquisition." The sound that emerged from the assembled instructors could best be described as the galactic equivalent of several expensive computers being thrown down a flight of stairs. Thymon's tentacles had gone completely rigid, while Crix's polished exoskeleton now reflected the kind of expression usually reserved for beings who have just watched their fundamental assumptions about reality get fed through a wood chipper. "You turned off the targeting assistance," Zekthara's voice had climbed approximately 3 octaves. The Mach VII's targeting system represents 15 centuries of technological development. It calculates trajectory, atmospheric interference, target movement prediction, and plasma decay rates across 7 dimensions of mathematical probability. Right, Jade agreed. But I could see the targets. Academy Protocol Manual, Section 847B, clearly stated that in the event of an unprecedented training incident, all participants should remain calm, document the occurrence, and report to Academy Administration for debriefing and psychological evaluation. What it didn't account for was what to do when the incident in question involved a species that apparently considered advanced targeting computers to be training wheels. The administrative officers of Nexus Combat Academy buzzed with the kind of nervous energy usually associated with impending court-martials or surprise health inspections. Dean Vaxis, whose Korthak physiology meant he literally couldn't sweat, was nonetheless giving a convincing impression of someone experiencing perspiration-related distress. Run the scenario again, he instructed the holographic display system, which dutifully recreated Jade Chen's weapons demonstration for the 14th time in the past hour. Around the conference table, representatives from multiple species watched the display with expressions ranging from disbelief to what could charitably be called existential dread. The human had fired 7 shots in 2.3 seconds, each one hitting targets at different ranges and angles, without using any of the technological assistance systems that had taken their civilizations millennia to develop. Perhaps, suggested Administrative Coordinator Thel, whose crystalline structure chimed softly when she spoke, this represents an anomaly. One individual with unusual capabilities doesn't necessarily indicate broader, species-wide competency. The Dean's secondary arms gestured toward a stack of files that had been hastily compiled over the past few hours. We've been receiving updated information about human military history from their diplomatic attaché. Did you know they have a concept called sniper that involves individuals eliminating targets from distances exceeding 5 kilometers using entirely mechanical projectile systems? The chiming from Coordinator Thel took on a decidedly discordant note. That's not possible without computer assistance. Apparently it is, Dean Vaxis replied, his mandibles clicking in what his species considered thoughtful contemplation. They also have something called close-quarters combat that seems to involve defeating opponents in personal combat without energy weapons, powered armor, or life support systems. Battlemaster Crix, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that our assumptions about technological dependence may be culturally biased. The suggestion hung in the recycled atmosphere like a gas leak waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, in the Academy's recreational facilities, Jade Chen was having what she considered a perfectly normal conversation with her fellow cadets, most of whom were struggling to process what they had witnessed during weapons training. So you just looked at the targets and shot them? Asked Cadet Vril, whose tentacled form rippled with patterns that the translation software was having difficulty interpreting. Without calculating trajectory mathematics or atmospheric interference coefficients. Jade paused in her consumption of what the Academy cafeteria optimistically called coffee, and actually tasted like someone had dissolved a chemistry set in regret. I mean, I calculated. Just not with a computer. It's not that complicated once you get a feel for it. A feel for it, repeated Cadet Zephyros, whose bioluminescent skin was currently displaying colors that suggested philosophical crisis. You estimated 7-dimensional mathematical calculations using organic neural processes. 3-dimensional, Jade corrected gently. The plasma moves in 3 dimensions. Everything else is just environmental factors. The silence that followed was interrupted by Cadet Bristax, whose chitinous exterior had been clattering nervously throughout the conversation. On my world, we have legends about warriors who could fight without technological assistance. We always assumed they were metaphorical. Jade considered this while attempting to determine whether the Academy's nutritional supplement dispenser could produce anything that resembled actual food rather than flavored polymer compounds. Where I come from, we have legends about civilizations so advanced they forgot how to do things without computers. We always figured those were cautionary tales. The next day's training session involved what Academy documentation referred to as multi-species combat coordination exercises, which translated roughly to "let's see how badly the new species performs when things get complicated." The simulation chamber could recreate any environment found within the known galaxy, adjust gravity and atmospheric conditions in real time, and generate holographic opponents indistinguishable from actual threats. Instructor Zekthara had spent considerable time designing what she considered an appropriately challenging scenario. The simulation would place teams of cadets in a hostile urban environment, facing enemies with superior numbers, advanced equipment, and knowledge of the terrain. Victory would require perfect coordination between species with radically different capabilities, tactical thinking several moves ahead of the opposition, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated elite warriors from everyone else who got recycled into component atoms. "Today's exercise," she announced to the assembled cadets, "will test your ability to function as a cohesive unit under adverse conditions. You will be divided into mixed-species teams and tasked with securing objectives while facing overwhelming opposition." She paused for dramatic effect, multifaceted eyes gleaming with anticipation. The human will be assigned to Team 7, along with Cadets Vril, Zephyros, and Bristax. Their objective is to secure a communications array located in the center of a hostile urban zone, defended by approximately 40 enemy combatants. What Instructor Zekthara didn't mention was that she had specifically designed the scenario to be impossible for a team that included a human. The enemies were positioned to take advantage of superior technology and numbers. The terrain favored defenders who could use elevated positions and energy shields. The time limit was calculated to prevent careful planning and force teams into hasty decisions that would result in spectacular failure. Team 7 materialized in the simulation chamber, which had been configured to resemble a war-torn city complete with rubble-strewn streets, partially collapsed buildings, and the kind of atmospheric effects that made everything look dramatically post-apocalyptic. The communications array gleamed in the distance, surrounded by defensive positions that would have impressed a paranoid dictator. Cadet Vril's tentacles rippled nervously as his sensors detected multiple enemy positions. Preliminary scan indicates 37 hostile signatures between our position and the objective. They have elevated firing positions, energy shields, and what appears to be automated defensive systems. Cadet Zephyros's bioluminescent patterns flickered through what the translation software identified as tactical anxiety. Standard assault protocols would require approximately 4 times our current force strength to achieve objective completion within acceptable casualty parameters. Cadet Bristax's chitinous armor clicked as he shifted position. Perhaps we should request additional equipment allocations or tactical support coordination. Jade Chen crouched behind a section of rubble and studied the target area with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for complex surgical procedures or traffic violations. "How long do we have?" "Mission parameters specify objective completion within 17 standard minutes," Vril reported. "Right." Jade checked the weapon she had been assigned for the exercise, a standard plasma rifle similar to the one she had used the previous day. "Here's what we're going to do." What followed was approximately 6 minutes of explanation that involved concepts like flanking maneuvers, suppressive fire, coordinated timing, and several tactical principles that hadn't appeared in any Academy textbook because they predated the invention of energy shields and automated defense systems. The actual assault took 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Team 7's coordinated attack began with what Academy tactical manuals would have classified as impossible. Jade Chen sprinted directly toward the most heavily defended position, drawing fire from approximately 15 enemy combatants, while her teammates moved to flanking positions. Instead of seeking cover, she used the rubble and destroyed vehicles as platforms for increasingly aggressive advances, firing with accuracy that turned the simulation's targeting algorithms into the digital equivalent of confused subbing. Cadet Vril discovered that his species' natural camouflage abilities, combined with what humans apparently called surprise, could neutralize enemies who had never encountered opponents willing to get within tentacle range of their defensive positions. Cadet Zephyros learned that his bioluminescent patterns could be weaponized to create visual confusion, while Cadet Bristax found that his chitinous armor was surprisingly effective when applied directly to enemy equipment at high velocity. By the time the simulation ended, Team 7 had not only secured the communications array, but had eliminated all enemy combatants, secured 3 additional objectives they hadn't been assigned, and accomplished everything with ammunition to spare. In the observation booth, Instructor Zekthara watched the after-action replay with the expression of someone discovering that everything she thought she knew about warfare had been compiled by individuals who had never actually seen combat. "Run it again," she instructed the computer system. The replay showed the same result. Jade Chen moving through defensive positions, like they had been designed by someone with a fundamental misunderstanding of how to stop advancing humans. Her teammates adapting tactics they had never been taught to support maneuvers that shouldn't have worked against technologically superior opponents. Computer, analyze tactical effectiveness of Team 7's assault methodology. The Academy's advanced artificial intelligence spent several seconds processing the request, which in computer terms was roughly equivalent to a few million years of deep philosophical contemplation. Analysis complete. Team 7's tactics demonstrate integration of multiple combat methodologies not present in current Academy curriculum. Effectiveness rating exceeds established parameters for simulation scenarios. Effectiveness rating. Team 7 completed primary objective 312% faster than optimal theoretical completion time, while sustaining 0 casualties and expending 23% of allocated resources. Recommend curriculum review. Instructor Zekthara's mandibles produced a sound like expensive crystal being fed through a garbage disposal. The Academy's emergency faculty meeting was called for what administration carefully termed curriculum assessment and strategic review, which everyone understood meant how do we handle the fact that our entire educational philosophy just got demolished by a species we thought was technologically primitive. Dean Vaxis presided over a conference room filled with instructors whose confidence in their teaching methods had been systematically dismantled over the past 48 hours. The holographic displays showed statistical analyses, tactical breakdowns, and performance metrics that painted a picture no one wanted to acknowledge. The human's performance, announced research coordinator Felix, whose gaseous form shimmered with what could charitably be called professional distress, indicates capabilities that exceed our current understanding of unaugmented biological potential. Her reaction times, accuracy ratings, and tactical adaptability fall outside established parameters for organic intelligence without technological enhancement. Battlemaster Crix's polished exoskeleton reflected the room's mood lighting as he spoke. Perhaps more concerning is the rapid improvement demonstrated by her teammates when operating under human tactical leadership. Cadets who previously showed adequate but unremarkable performance suddenly exceeded their established capability ratings by significant margins. The implications, Dean Vaxis said slowly, suggest that our training methodologies may be incomplete. The silence that followed was pregnant with the kind of implications that usually result in budget reviews and uncomfortable conversations with oversight committees. Instructor Prime Zekthara, whose crystalline carapace had lost most of its usual lustrous polish, finally spoke. "I have reviewed the human diplomatic files more thoroughly. It appears their species has engaged in continuous warfare for their entire recorded history. They have developed tactical and strategic methodologies without relying on technological advantages we consider essential." She paused, mandibles clicking with what her species considered careful consideration. "They fight the way we did before we developed energy weapons and powered armor. The difference is, they never stopped." Administrative Coordinator Thell's crystalline structure chimed with harmonics that suggested uncomfortable realization. "Are we suggesting that technological advancement may have created tactical limitations rather than advantages?" "I'm suggesting," the dean replied, "that we may need to reconsider what we're actually teaching our cadets." While the Academy's administration grappled with philosophical questions about the nature of warfare and technological dependence, Jade Chen was in the Academy's medical bay treating Cadet Bristax for what she had diagnosed as acute stress-related carapace brittleness. Her medical training, it turned out, translated surprisingly well to species that weren't technically human, mostly because trauma was trauma regardless of how many limbs or eyes were involved. "Your species," Bristax observed as Jade applied what the Academy medical system had identified as an appropriate healing compound, "approaches problems differently than we were taught in tactical assessment courses." "How so?" Jade asked, adjusting the medical scanner to account for Bristax's chitinous physiology. "You assume solutions exist," he replied. "Our training emphasized calculating probability of success before attempting objective completion. You appear to calculate probability after you've already achieved the objective. Jade considered this while reviewing the scanner's readings, which suggested that Bristax's stress levels were returning to normal ranges. I guess when you come from a place where the problems don't wait for you to calculate optimal solutions, you get used to working with whatever you've got and figuring out the details as you go. This is normal for human tactical thinking. Pretty much. We call it improvising. She made a final adjustment to the healing compound application. There, you should be fine in a few hours. Try to get some rest and avoid any more existential crises about the nature of warfare. As Bristax left the medical bay, Jade reflected on the past few days. She had come to Nexus Combat Academy, expecting to learn advanced military techniques from civilizations that had been perfecting warfare for millennia. Instead, she seemed to be accidentally teaching those same civilizations that sometimes the most advanced technique was remembering that the fundamentals worked just fine. The Academy's Strategic Review Committee concluded their meetings with what would later be remembered as the Great Curriculum Reformation of 2387. The changes implemented were extensive, fundamental, and based on what they carefully termed integration of alternative tactical methodologies previously unrepresented in Academy programming. What this meant, in practical terms, was that Jade Chen went from being a student to being what the Academy diplomatically called a cultural exchange consultant and alternative tactics specialist. Her new responsibilities involved working with instructors to develop training programs that didn't assume every problem could be solved with superior technology and computational power. The results were immediate and, depending on one's perspective, either revolutionary or terrifying. Cadets who had previously struggled with scenarios requiring improvisation suddenly discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Species that had relied on energy shields and automated systems learned that sometimes the most effective tactic was the one their enemy didn't expect because it was supposedly obsolete. Instructor Prime Zekthara, whose initial condescension had evolved into something approaching professional respect mixed with healthy apprehension, found herself teaching courses with names like pre-technological combat applications and organic intelligence tactical integration. Her students, instead of merely memoizing optimal firing solutions and computer-assisted targeting protocols, were learning to think tactically without digital assistance. The human approach, she explained to a new class of cadets, assumes that technology should enhance natural capability rather than replace it. This represents a fundamental philosophical difference from our traditional methodologies. She gestured toward the weapons display, which now included what were carefully termed kinetic projectile systems, alongside the energy weapons that had previously dominated Academy curricula. Today we will be learning to operate without automated targeting assistance, atmospheric calculation algorithms, or predictive trajectory analysis. You will be required to manually estimate distance, wind speed, target movement, and projectile drop using only organic sensory input and mathematical reasoning. The assembled cadets, representing 12 different species with varying numbers of eyes, limbs, and fundamental assumptions about reality, listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for instructions on avoiding immediate death. This may seem primitive, Zekthara continued, but remember that the human who demonstrated these techniques has a success rate that exceeds our most advanced technological systems. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether these methods are obsolete, but whether we have become too dependent on tools that may not always be available. In the back of the classroom, Jade Chen observed the lesson with satisfaction. The Academy had initially viewed her as a curiosity, a representative of a species that hadn't yet learned to properly appreciate the superiority of advanced technology. Instead, she had accidentally reminded them that technology was supposed to serve its users, not the other way around. The irony wasn't lost on her that an institution dedicated to training the galaxy's finest warriors had somehow forgotten that the most important weapon in any arsenal was the mind using it. They had spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated tools while neglecting the fundamental skills that made those tools effective. Now, watching cadets from species that had mastered faster-than-light travel learn to aim without computer assistance, she reflected on the nature of advancement and the difference between sophistication and effectiveness. Sometimes the most advanced solution was remembering that the basics worked just fine, especially when your opponent had forgotten them entirely. The Academy's transformation didn't happen overnight, but the results were undeniable. Graduation rates improved as cadets learned to think tactically rather than merely execute predetermined algorithms. Combat effectiveness ratings increased across all species as students developed the kind of adaptability that came from understanding principles rather than memorizing procedures. More importantly, the Academy's graduates were returning to their home systems with skills that their militaries had never seen before. The ripple effects were spreading throughout the galaxy, as combat doctrines that had remained unchanged for centuries suddenly found themselves being questioned by officers who had learned to fight like humans. The Galactic Military Council's official response to these developments was carefully neutral, noting that alternative tactical methodologies represented valuable additions to existing strategic frameworks. Unofficially, however, recruitment applications to Nexus Combat Academy had increased by approximately 847% as species that had previously considered their military training complete suddenly decided they might benefit from a human perspective on warfare. 6 months after her arrival at the Academy, Jade Chen stood in the same weapons training facility where she had first encountered Instructor Prime Zekthara's plasma rifle demonstration. The room looked the same, but the dynamics had changed fundamentally. Instead of one human learning to use alien technology, there were now representatives from 37 species learning to fight the way humans had been fighting for millennia. Zekthara approached carrying the same Mach 7 plasma disruptor that had started everything, but her demeanor was entirely different. Gone was the condescending superiority, replaced by something that looked remarkably like professional curiosity. "Instructor Chen," she said, using the title that still made Jade smile, "I've been reviewing the performance statistics from our latest graduating class. Combat effectiveness ratings have improved by an average of 23% across all species, with some individuals showing improvements exceeding 60%. "That's good to hear," Jade replied, accepting the weapon for what had become a routine demonstration for new students. "Though I suspect most of the improvement comes from them learning to trust their own judgment rather than depending entirely on their equipment." Indeed. Zekthara's mandibles clicked in what Jade had learned to recognize as thoughtful agreement. "We had become so focused on technological superiority that we forgot the importance of the operator. Your species reminded us that the most sophisticated weapon in the galaxy is useless if the person using it can't think tactically." Jade raised the plasma rifle, noted its familiar weight and balance, and fired a sequence of shots that eliminated 7 targets in 3 seconds. Then she engaged the safety, handed it back to Zekthara, and smiled. "Any questions?" The assembled students, representing species from across the known galaxy, watched with the kind of attention usually reserved for religious experiences or impending natural disasters. They had come to learn about advanced weapons systems and sophisticated tactical algorithms. Instead, they were learning that sometimes the most advanced technique was the oldest one, applied by someone who understood that technology was a tool, not a crutch. As the training session continued, Jade reflected on the unexpected turn her academy experience had taken. She had arrived expecting to learn from civilizations that had been perfecting warfare for millennia. Instead, she had discovered that those same civilizations had something to learn from a species that was still figuring out how to leave their own solar system without breaking something important. The lesson, she supposed, was that advancement wasn't always about having the most sophisticated tools. Sometimes it was about remembering that the most important piece of equipment was the mind using everything else. And sometimes the most valuable education involved teaching teachers that their students might have something to offer in return. The Academy continued its transformation, evolving from an institution that trained students to use advanced technology into one that taught them to think strategically with or without technological assistance. The change was subtle but profound, affecting not just individual combat effectiveness but entire military philosophies across multiple star systems. And it all started with an instructor who fired a shot past a student's ear, expecting to demonstrate the gap between primitive and advanced species. Instead, she learned that sometimes the most primitive approach was the most advanced one of all, especially when applied by someone who had never forgotten that the purpose of weapons training wasn't to create better tools, but to develop better warriors. The galaxy, it turned out, had a lot to learn from a species that had never stopped learning how to fight.